They say no one wants to hear what a kid wrote last month.
Well, I like your songs.
Where the winds hit heavy on the borderline.
Who wrote this?
He did.
So, James, you made the compelling decision to center this film on 4 pivotal years of Bob Dylan's life. What edicts of telling this story were most non-negotiable for you going into this process? And what were the lessons that you learned telling other true stories, Walk the Line and 4V Ferrari, that you applied to crafting your vision for this film?
For me, it was the fable. What was so attractive, obviously, Bob Dylan, the music, the kind of mystery and enigma that surrounds him, that's all interesting and exciting. But in terms of crafting a drama, there's a temptation and almost a crutch, I think, when you're writing true life stories to start with birth and end with death. What's unusual in a story is to find a piece of a life that makes sense, both in dramatic unity with some kind of symmetry, and obviously there's a theme that runs through it the same way we would demand of a fiction film. And what struck me about this period in Bob's life was how dramatically it seemed to me to have all those aspects. When I met with Dylan, I said to him, I think it's about a guy in Minnesota, a young man who's suffocating, who leaves everything behind, family, friends, and travels 2,000 miles, invents himself anew, and starts a new life, and blossoms, makes new friends, starts a new family, and then starts to suffocate again, and leaves. And he smiled. That's a story that's not just about Bob Dylan, but in many ways about all of our lives. Maybe less dramatically, but about the changes we have to make, the kind of when we have to move on or grow up or reinvent or rethink ourselves, as Bob himself says, he who is, what is it?
He not busy being born is busy dying.
Thank you, saved me. And then your second part was?
Oh, just lesson that you had learned telling other true stories that you applied here or necessarily didn't apply here. Such a different film.
You know, free your actors from the tyranny of mimicry. You know, I love Bob's energy, but I also love Timmy's energy, and I love Elle's energy, and Monica's, and Edward's, and Boyd's, and I want to make sure they're not so enslaved to research that they lose the part of them that I need them to bring, because it's not just about who they're playing and how much they look like them or whether their chin or their mannerism is exactly the same, but it's do they bring, and I think they all did, in my opinion, but bring their soul, to these roles. And I'm so incredibly proud of this group of people to my left, because we've been together for a long time working on this movie, and I deeply love them, and I'm really proud of them because they all reached very deep and very hard. So there's the answer to that.
Thank you. So Timothy, James has said of you in this role, I didn't want Timmy to disappear. I wanted him to bring who he is to Bob, which he just gave us a preview of that. I kind of just said that. You did just say that. So for me, after you mastered the music piece of it and the playing and the harmonica and the guitar, what aspects of yourself did you bring to this?
Well, I love that there was a natural segue to that based on what Jim was just saying, and it reminded me over the process of the shooting that I felt that attitude from James. I felt that I could push myself to the limit of Don't Look Back, the D.A. Pennebaker documentary, or No Direction Home, or I would love a D.A. Pennebaker clap, but that movie was really a Bible, to the extent that, as you just described, when I saw the film, I never had the image of marrying myself to it, because more than any role I've ever done, this is the one where I pushed myself the most, and I had more time. We started working on this in 2018. There was some idea to do it in the summer of 2020. Then obviously the pandemic hit, which gave me a lot more time to get into the music. So by the time we got going, this felt less like a process or work and more, a release in some way. I continue to discover Bob's music, because at some point I told myself I want to stick to the 60s, maybe early 70s, because the man and the enigma continued to evolve and shift, and went on to make gospel music at some point, music for God, and it was music I wasn't allowing myself to discover, and now I'm, my new playlist is Time Out of Mind and Shot of Love and Slow Train Coming, and he is the guy in my worldview. He's the artist, and we get to be a asterisk on that legacy in some way. That's kind of how we're an interpretation of a time, and just being that interpretation is an enormous honor.
Elle, your character is so compelling, and it's interesting to find out that one of the few requests that Bob had for James was that her name be changed from the woman on whom she is based in the real relationship in his life. And I was curious, how did knowing that and knowing his sense of protection for this woman help guide you in your scenes with Timothée, but also just in your understanding of her?
Yeah, it actually, I remember because I was curious, I was like, oh, why is her name Sylvie? And Jim telling me that. There was like subconsciously, not a weight, but just a thought that was requested, because obviously that relationship meant so much to him, and it's a precious thing because she's the one person who knew him before he became who he was. And I think kind of the challenge for me was I didn't have as much like material to rely on. I mean, Suze wrote a beautiful memoir like recounting her time with Bob, but also so much more about her life called A Freewheelin' Time that I read, and that helped. But that can also only go so far, because also the audience, they don't know her like they know the others. And she doesn't sing songs, she doesn't play an instrument. So it really, I had to rely on building a relationship with Timothée. And I just felt kind of always like on the tip of emotion, like most times. And I think that was important for Sylvie because she's very vulnerable and open emotionally, and having music on the set and all these like wonderful people who're singing their songs and playing their instruments with these beautiful folk, poems, essentially, like that surrounding you really helped to bring me into that time and space. And just being around such good actors, and it was a really special experience.
In reading more about Pete Seeger, it was interesting for me to see how he was regarded as a folk music angel of sorts. And something that you said about this role and also his relationship with Bob Dylan, what's interesting about their relationship, it has to do with the way people can cross paths, be on the same path, and then diverge without judgment, which I think is really interesting, because there's always that moment where you think, oh, are they going to start to have vitriolic feelings for each other, bitterness? But that wasn't the case. So tell me how you harnessed that and also brought, I guess, another layer to Pete without making him seem like such a sweet guy and not very believable, maybe,
I think Jim was in many ways a shrink, a very effective psychiatrist for all of us, because you can get very psychologically weighted down with the burden of iconic artists and mimicry and all of it. And sometimes I'll depart this narrative entirely in my own mind and sort of go down. Joseph Campbell would talk about, how we tell the same story over and over again, and I would look for another metaphor. And at some point I thought to myself that Pete Seeger was sort of like Gandalf, and this was the Lord of the Rings, and Dylan is Frodo, and he gives him the ring of power and needs him to carry it for him, and that actually worked quite well for me. In many ways, Jim was terrific at bringing us back to what he called like the juicy paradoxes of, the way that mutual affection and mutual respect can quickly turn into a sense of expectation and obligation, and the way that people can both love and respect each other and get quite irritated with each other and finished with each other. And it made the whole thing feel more ephemeral and easier to dig down into the individual moments.
Absolutely, and that comes through 100%. Monica, so you had the enviable tenacity to track down Joan Baez herself and speak to her before production. What do you remember about that conversation, and what did you take from whatever interaction you had, apply it to the work, but also, again, sort of what Timothée did, bring enough of yourself to it where you were avoiding this sort of, I'm playing this famous person approach?
A really wonderful thing about Joan is that she's always been very honest about herself. She's written about herself, and she speaks very candidly in interviews and documentaries. And she said a wonderful thing that actually ties in so beautifully to what Jim was saying. And that is, if you're trying to make a piece of art perfect, you're robbing it of what makes it interesting. I sort of borrowed that for this because I can be a really intense perfectionist, and I was trying to get her exactly right. She is such a spirited individual and a fascinating person. Just the last thing I wanted to do was rob her of any of that identity. It was an emotional experience to hear her voice on the phone, and that was the night before I actually sang in front of an audience for the first time. It was a really beautiful experience to get to perform Don't Think Twice the next day, and we did a take, and Jim was like, have more fun with it. And I was like, okay. And I think that was the first time I really did enjoy it.
Congratulations. So amazing. And Boyd, as Johnny Cash, also wonderful to see you in this. Very good. I was fascinated to learn that you had access to letters written between Johnny and Bob. What was revealed in their correspondence that surprised you and that helped to inform your approach to playing him during this particular time in Johnny's life? This wasn't the beginning of his career, it wasn't the end, it was really he was in a turning point phase.
Well, I found it really fascinating that a guy in his 30s would reach out to a 19, 20-year-old kid and tell him what of an admirer he is of his music. I don't know if it came around a little bit later in Jim's research that Johnny had lost these letters, and it's only through Bob that Bob kept the letters. So it kind of really says a lot about which person was which. Because you saw that in the writing. It was very, I wouldn't say raunchy, but it was two guys writing letters back and forth that only those two people can understand the height of fame, what it means to be trying to express yourself with this poetry, but then being so isolated by the success of all that and having to wrap your head around that. And I think John had probably experienced a lot of that, and Bob's at a crossroads in his life of which way to go, and that's where Johnny comes in and gives him the encouragement to keep your voice, and at all costs, if you have to go down with the ship, go down with the ship. Seeing those letters and then finding in what Jim had written in these scenes and how to put that personality and that personification into that, where we're all talking about this iconic people and not to tarnish their imagery. We're here to celebrate these people's lives. So to find out in the scene of how you can put in the rascal of Johnny Cash and what makes him that, and for Bob to have one person on his shoulder telling him this and another person on his shoulder telling him to be you. It's going to be weird if you're not. So, the letters were very informative.
Well, we are so happy for you and proud of everyone on this stage. Thank you so much for
Thank
making
you
this
so much.
film.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.